Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. My name is Ram Satish Pasupuleti. I am an assistant professor in Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Today we are going to discuss about temporary shelter reconstruction in Kenya. So this particular lecture has been derived from one of the important contribution from Daifed Abre, which is Chapter 9 in Build Back Better volume, which has been edited by Michael Lyons and Theo Schilderman with Camelio Bonham. So he talks about, can temporary shelter contribute to participatory reconstruction? So that is the link between the transition shelter and with the participation, and how it can actually make shift into the permanent process. The background of Kenyan condition, it is not a natural disaster, but it is a kind of man-made situations, especially the political violence. When you look at the natural disasters phenomenon or the risk phenomenon, even from the document of at risk or the CRED reports, it says almost more than 75% to 80% of the disasters are through the political violence. So today we are going to talk about the consequences of the political violence, especially in terms of shelter provision, and how it has been organized and how it has been conducted as a pilot project, and how it has been scaled up at a nation level, and what kind of responses they have able to understand. So in 2007 and 8, after the former President Mwai Kibaki was declared the winner of the presidential elections in December 27, 2007, there's been a huge political clashes, and along with various ethnic groups within the country, and about 1,200 people have been reported dead. Almost 5 lakhs people displaced. That is as per the United Nations Office Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs report. So ideally there are 3 categories of this. One is, the first was burning and looting of the shops, commercial premises and houses. So all these mobs, they come to the city in the urban clusters, and they started destroying or burning down whether it is the public property, whether it is the commercial properties. So this is one kind of attack. And the second was an onslaught by opposition supporters on small farmers and landholders in the Rift Valley, perceived to be government supporters, within the aim of driving them away from the region. So that is also how opposition parties make an attempt to drive all these people from the region. And the third one is of the pattern of a violence was retaliatory and targeted mainly at the migrant workers. People have suspected that this has been a part of the opposition supporters. So that is where the 3 patterns of victims have been analyzed. In the Rift Valley, which is the majorly affected area, displacement affected 5 of Kenya's 8 provinces. In Kenya we have 8 provinces, and which has been concentrated in the Rift Valley province, particularly in Nakuru, Trans-Nzoia and Uasin Gishu districts. So after this kind of rebel groups forcing them and destroying the properties and attacking the people, so this has caused a huge social destruction. And in any kind of such situations, obviously what kind of responses, the immediate response, how people cope up to this kind of shocks and the stress. One is move to the host families, and some of them, they tend to move to their host families, or like people who are migrants, from different places, they go back to their places. Set up spontaneous camps in police stations and churches, because the religious buildings, the schools, the police stations, so these are some places where they can protect themselves and they can gather. At least certain ethnic group can be protected by the with under the protection of police station or in a religious governance. So this is how they started setting up some camps. Many sought to move to their ancestral homes in Nyaja and western and central provinces. So they go back to their parental homes or the ancestral homes. So in that way they could able to be secure themselves for some time. So what you can see is about the big circles here, what you are seeing is it's about more than 30,000 people have been internal displaced populations. And this is the size of the circle gives a shows of between 10,000 to 30,000, which is a medium range, and below less than 1,000, which is a smaller IDPs. And displacement of these affected 5 of these 8 provinces. And out of the whole process, we can see at least in 2009, we have 3,13,921 people have been internally displaced persons integrated in their communities. But whereas the rest of them, they have been recorded in 296 camps, have been positioned in various camps. So what you can see is these camps which have been temporary shelters, whether it is the pygmy kind of shelters or a kind of conical shelters with a plastic sheet or the tarpaulin sheets where they try to accommodate in a huge groups, and some basic services have been provided in those camps, in these clusters. So how the government have tackled with this situation? The government of Kenya's Ministry of State for Special Programs, which we call it as MOSSP, the Ministry of State for Special Programs, and this particular ministry's mission is to provide the leadership in the development of risk reduction measures and disaster management within Kenya. And this has looked at the oversee of the IDP, international persons, and the resettlement process. So UNHCR have also supported that the KRCS, which is the Kenyan government agency which has been constituted to provide the resettlement program, and they have given some kind of support. So Kenyan government have thought that they are self-sufficient to manage this resettlement process, but still there's been some support from the UNHCR. But in terms of the understanding of the hierarchy of the government setup, one is the Minister for Provincial Administration and Internal Security, which has been looking at the internal security aspects. And they are further directed with the Provincial Commission, because as I said, there's 8 provinces. So each province has been headed by a provincial commissioner. And then it further is reflected in the district. Each province is divided into different districts. So that is where we have and each district is headed by the district commissioner. And whereas each district is again divided into subdivisions, and that is where the district officer has been heading the division. And again, each division is composed of different villages, and the chief has been constituted to look at the village level. But now in this IDP process, the internal displacement of these persons, first of all, how to identify who is the most important people to be secured enough to put them in the camps or to put them in the transitional center. So how we can profile it and how to make the damage assessments. So this has been conducted as a part of the provincial commissioner's responsibilities in coordination with all the subgroups, which is a district level and the chief level. So they are able to see a kind of vertical coordination. Also, the support to KRCS and the humanitarian actors in establishing and managing the IDP camps. Activate village level peace reconciliation committees. So these are all a kind of bureaucratic system, how each group is linked and how they are able to respond, how they are able to give support for this kind of IDP setup. So initially, there's a compensation package issued by the government about in the Kenyan of 10,000, which is about 100 euros per IDP household, and an additional 25,000 for each household with a destroyed house. So that is how They have given about 250 euros plus 100 euros. So that is a kind of compensation package. But then this was not very successful. Different analysis reports and evaluation reports talk about this particular process lacks accountability and consistency in allocation of 10,000 and 25,000 Kenyan currency for these IDPs. And this is where they also started an operation called Operation Rudi Nyumbani, which is how to return to home, because we cannot keep providing them all the facilities for how long one can provide. So that is where the transition camps have been provided initially, but then how we can reduce the support system, and so that how we can make them independent of this process. So this is where the Operation Rudi Nyumbani Return Home has been set up, and it has been accelerated to close the temporary camps. So this is where many of these remaining they organized themselves into self-help groups, 50 to 44,000 households. And in order to obtain the land, each group member contributed its government cash handouts into a communal fund and brought rural plots of land for permanent settlement and moved there with their tents. So which means whatever the cash inflows they've got, some of them they tried to form into groups and they put some money and they bought some plots in the rural areas so that they can move with their tents. And one such group is Nyandarua, registered membership of 4,000 households, which has acquired about 50 acres land. And they made their own makeshift latrines and obtained water by nearby. So basic services is an important task. How in order to just live there, for them it is not just only a shelter, it also has to be with the service aspect. And the tenure has become a big issue in this particular phase, because and also profiling the vulnerable people who are the beneficiaries is also an important task. So in that way, the government also tried to reduce, they are planning to reduce their support so that they can slowly become independent. Whereas the district level planning departments, they have actually assisted some of the groups in terms of land subdivision and tenure issues, and also district water authorities also assisted some with the boreholes, so that some service infrastructure could be set up for them. So you can see here that the IDP, how it has actually progressed, and it has come down later on. The number of internally displaced persons, how they have come down gradually. In terms of the housing reconstruction, because this transitional shelter, it is not just a noun, it is not narrowed down to a product, it is a verb, it is a process. It is a catalyst to enable families to make a step change from dependency on external assistance. Anticipated that the provision of transitional shelter on owners' land would be trigger return. That is where this is a process of how you have to make them aware of the situation, and so that they can become independent. So this is how the definition of transitional shelter, which it says that transitional shelter provides a habitable covered living space and a secure, healthy living environment with privacy and dignity to those within it during the period between a conflict or a natural disaster and the achievement of a durable shelter solution. So there is also the time factor. So between the event, and this is an event of disaster, and this is about settling down. So this particular phase, they need to be served with some dignity, some basic services, some basic safety aspect. And how do I can identify the target groups? So what they did was, they have broadly classified into 3 target groups. One is those who wish to return to their formal place of residence, those who wish to relocate elsewhere in the country, those who wish to integrate in their current place of displacement. So how they can integrate. The second one is go back to the former place. The third one is go to somewhere else. And then these groups have been further subdivided based on land tenure, whether they have land or without land, or intend to rent, or those without who intend to buy land. So this is how the different categories they have identified. And the Irish NGO, they have given a kind of target working group, and the shelter working group along with the Irish NGO goal with coordination with the UNHCR, they have developed a kind of joint shelter strategy. So there have been this particular strategy have addressed some key issues that has to be included in the process. One is the target group selection to ensure access to the most vulnerable, whether it is the women-headed families, or it is an elderly group, or if they have lost their houses. So the widely varying degree of shelter experience and knowledge of design and construction between assistance agencies, which can lead to inadequate solutions with significant variance between shelter solutions. So also there is a disconnect between the transitional shelter and the permanent provision, and design of uncertainty, because we are not sure how this is going to turn out. So the durable shelter endpoint was unknown. So you are providing a shelter, but how long they are going to stay here and how long it is going to last, how people are going to respond is very uncertain. There is also need to integrate livelihood assistance with shelter provision, because it is not just for the home we are providing, how they can procure their livelihood later on, how they can do their farming facilities, how they can, if they are any labor, how they can get the work. So these are all the livelihood aspects which has to be addressed. In the households selection, in assisting target group 1, the following prerequisites has been applied, where the security in the area of return, because the first and most is because already they have been undergoing a lot of shocks because of the political stresses. So first thing we have to ensure the security in the area of return. Household registration, that is where they have to register who are the beneficiaries and all. Willingness of household to return, so whether they are coming back with voluntarily they are coming back. Evidence of land or house ownership which was readily available in district level cadastres. So whether they have procured some land or not. So in that way they could able to see the household selections. But the problem is with this kind of categories, it's not possible to accommodate everyone. Everyone may not have procured the land. Everyone may not have able to afford to make their own move. So there is a bit complex situation of the resources. The financial resources may not be sufficient for the whole entire community. So that is where you need to select only the neediest, giving the priority for the neediest households, and who would be eligible for the shelter assistance with priority. And then shelter design, because this is where the owner-driven practices are already advocated in many disaster and displacement practices. And this is where they talked about how we can incrementally upgrade the temporary structures to the permanent houses, relocation of shelters, or disassembly of shelter materials with meaningful reuse. So because once if you are making a temporary shelters and if you are making another project of permanent shelters, what happens to this material? So how we can reuse these materials? These are some of the important considerations which has been given. And what they did was, when in the developing the design process and analysis was being made on the existing shelter typologies in that Rift Valley, and they are basically a very simple techniques of timber pole houses, timber frame structures with the structural poles dug into the ground, and usually a cedar has been used to resist from the insect attack and the rot. So floors have been compressed earth, walls are made with mud or timber roofs, sometimes in an iron sheet or a thatch. So what you can see is now these are all some of the traditional patterns which they could able to gather from that location, and how they just dug the timber poles and then they try to make the frame, and that is how a small low cost house has been developed. They've also adopted some basic principles. One is ability to build and inhabit the shelter within 2 days of receiving assistance. So how quickly one can build. ability to upgrade temporary shelters into permanent houses. So one is from a kind of transition shelter, how it could be upgraded to a permanent shelter, whether it's because that is where we talk about the robust quality of the house. Ability to disassemble the shelter and move to a different site. Imagine in the other category which we discussed, if they want to relocate, they found a land in some place, they want to move this house there. So how we can actually dismantle this and how we can refix the same thing. Ability to disassemble the shelter and reuse components significantly in permanent housing reconstruction. Maybe some components we can still use in the permanent shelter reconstruction. Ability to extend shelters from basic SPEAR standards to suit specific owner driven. The SPEAR standards have set up some guidance what to do and what not to do. So based on the SPEAR standards, the following kit has been prepared. One is they developed a living space of 18 square meters, which is about 3 into 6 meters, for up to 5 individuals. And then the shelter will be directly on the ground, elevated dirt floor with proper drainage around the structure. The structural frame is made of wooden poles, while the roofing will consist of corrugated galvanized iron sheets nailed to the structure because of the moisture and other things. The beneficiaries will then build the walls with materials locally available, such as additional corrugated iron sheets, mud and straw bricks. So that is where, so basically it provides the structure and the communities can actually fill that, the shelter with their own feasible material. Now what you can see is based on these guidelines, the goal and the UNHCR brought local artisans to upgrade, to build the prototypes in this Nakuru place. So it's a kind of pilot project where by doing so they have also taken the feedback of the people and how we can improve it further. So that is one of the form which you can see, a shelter prototype which has a timber post and as well the plastic sheets has been tied around. And then these artisans started modifying the design. The pole sizes were too small and inadequately spaced, built a housing frame used on vernacular technology of the Rift Valley. And by doing so, this whole component become heavier and the reducing the transportability of shelters, because it's very difficult for them to transport from one place to another place. But enhancing the ability to upgrade and offering more options in the reuse of materials. So, but still it has given a scope to enhance, to upgrade and with the given shelter. Many of them, they felt it was small, but then the introduction of this plastic sheeting has a temporary wall material that many people, as a psychological interpretation, they felt it is not durable. But the agencies somehow they have ignored all this process. And when this whole pilot project has been finished, and that is where the beneficiaries have objected to use the plastic sheeting. But when they want to scale up this project, that is where they say that 86% of the survey, they have said that the transition shelters were larger than their previous houses. And this is where, based on the feedback, based on some adjustments, a bill of quantity has been derived from the prototype shelter, and where a standard shelter kit has been developed, about 497 shelter kits in its Nakaru warehouse. So now each kit has a 18 square meter house which is costing about $385. And what they did was, the goal agency have trucked all the materials to the accessible central points, delivering about 120 kits per distribution. Then the community members offload the truck and then they divided the materials into kits. And each household then arranged the transportation from the distribution point to their home. So it's basically from one central space, then they started distributing to the intermediate points, and then the community members facilitated themselves to transport to their, whether by using their own labor or hiring the assistance of donkeys or tractors or any pickups. So the artisans assisted beneficiaries in setting out their shelters, monitored the quality and provided the technical assistance. But most of these kits have been erected in a day's time, 2 days, 3 days. So it's a very quick development process. But in any disasters, we have also understood that the personalization is a natural response to the cultural deficiencies and as well as the economic feasibilities and opportunities. So what people started developing was they by towards an year, the people started developing to upgrade their house using the timber offcuts. What you can see is the timber shingles, the waste shingles. They try to cover with that and make more of a permanent look. And also this is a kind of partial upgrade with reclaimed materials. They developed with kind of whatever they have able to procure from the past site or with their feasibilities. They have made some modifications to their shelters. And within a month, 53% of the house owners has started to upgrade their shelters. And this is very quick. Within a month, if this kind of changes, 53%. The priorities were first doors, second walls, and the third is windows. So the ventilation aspect. And some beneficiaries bought their own timber for walls, doors, and windows. As you have seen in this, so the complete set is in a timber. For the outset, and they used the plastic sheeting provided to the line of the walls. So they covered with a kind of partial covering with the plastic sheet. Others sold their plastic sheeting and hired the local artisans to build adobe walls. So they have given it back and they sold it in the market, and they could able to get some money, and they could able to put some more money and build the adobe walls. And so this whole process, it's all showing up an incremental process depending on each household, what kind of economic feasibility they had, what kind of infill they are responding to their needs and demands. And some paid for the labor in kind using the tools they were given in the shelter kit, and some sold their tools once shelters were complete to buy household furnishings. So once the tools have been sold out, they even bought some more household furnishings and fittings. So with this, the government have understood that yes, there is a possibility that to scale up this process. So now what they did was they developed from 18 square meters to 20 square meters and the permanent walls of adobe and timber, and they launched a project to build about 40,000 low-cost houses. So by the end of March 2009, it's about 16,240 were built, and mainly with the partnership of UNHCR and MOSSP. So this is a kind of a very bulk project, and the Japanese agencies and different NGOs also have given us support for them. But when you talk about the theoretical understanding of it, as I said to you in the beginning, transition shelter is not a noun, it is a verb, it is a process. So as Christopher Alexander describes as a house as an activity which is created gradually as a direct result of living, which is happening in it and around it by people who spend only what they can afford. So it starts with you when you actually start personalizing your own spaces. When you start living in it, you realize that what you need, and accordingly people start amending that. Not only within the house, around the house. And this is similar observations made from John F.C. Turner's on his work in Mexico, housing by people. So that is where he talks about the use value derived from this approach was more significant than the market value, as what housing does for the user is more important than what it is. So this is not a product, it is a process, how a man evolves a house into a home. He tried to see that the use value is more significant than the market value. And similarly, John Habraken supports on 3 levels of decision making. One is the tissue and the support, which is a base building. The tissue refers to the urban fabric, and the support refers to the base building, and the fit out refers to the infill, what the people have done in their houses. And the tissue tends to remain the same because it's a larger content. And the supports will change with time, and infill will change more regularly. So this keeps changing very frequently. And the system of subdivision allows users to interface with the level that is relevant to them. So how each community responds to these different 3 categories. The consumer or a household, they act on an infill level. The housing corporation or a development agency on a support level, or the municipality works on a tissue level. And similarly, buildings are also essentially made of 6 time-bound layers. There's a space-time phenomenon which Ian Bentley also talks about it. One is a site, which generally does not change, although a few buildings are transportable. The structure, the foundations and load-bearing elements are expensive to change, because in the structure, once if you set up the foundation, it's very difficult to change. You can break the walls, you can take out the prefab walls. So people generally try to avoid doing that. The skin, which is the exterior surfaces, and these may change over 20 years or so. Whereas the services, working goods of a building, electrics, plumbing, which wear out periodically. So you need a periodic maintenance of it. A space plan, an interior layout where walls, ceilings, floors, and doors go. Commercial spaces can change as often as every 3 years and remain the same for 30 years. And the stuff, the intermediate elements of furniture, appliances may change even monthly or even daily. Similarly, Ian Bentley also talks about how different layers of the space-time, the underlying topography, the natural system, and the public linkage system, and the plots, and the buildings, and the components, which changes at different time aspects. Once a kit is developed, if a standard structure is acceptable in an owner-driven process, and this kind of intervention is upgradable temporary shelter than budgeting, procurement and distribution of standardized kits is a relatively small, simple operation. If the intervention is permanent construction, then the standardized structural options designed in collaboration with end users can be developed into standard bill of quantities and set key stage grant disbursements, because each stage you have to look at the funding allocation as well. And while still allowing flexibility on the design of skin and space plan. So there is a basic co-dwelling concept comes, and how we can tailor different options within it. This is much lighter on professional resources and time than an entirely bespoke approach. And we have to understand, when we were dealing with this kind of poor communities, one has to look at the livelihoods framework. It is not just only a shelter. And this is where the DFID's SL framework, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, is very apt in considering, because how an individual or a communities or a social group, how their abilities to access certain resources, whether it is a social, economic, human, natural, political, whatever the resources, how they are able to access the resources. On one hand, they are already subjected to the vulnerability context. They are already in the context, which will have some influence on their access to the abilities, and abilities to access the resources. And that is where we talk about, with these abilities, how they transform the structures and the processes, whether in the form of regulatory framework, whether in the form of public and private sector, and then how they create their own livelihood opportunities. And this is where we talk about the more income, increased well-being, reduced vulnerability, increased food security, like that. There's a whole set of framework which actually an individual or a group or a community can actually work with it. So this is very important when we are looking at the transitional shelter, and as well as when they are actually looking at the owner-driven process. You need to understand the whole resources and the vulnerability context itself. The enabling approach, how we can enable this process. And one is the finance. Because this is one, the enabling approach recognizes a bottleneck to housing, create limited access to finance. So we talked about the cash flows. We talked about how at a stage wise, how we can deliver the financial disbursement. Land tenure. We talk about the access to land and security of tenure, which are the prerequisites for any provision of adequate shelter for all. Also the materials and labor, because materials have a major cost implications. And also inappropriate building regulations can inhibit the production of housing. So the legal frameworks, that is where we talk about the governments can play a key role in supporting the creation of enabling environments for housing provision through reviewing legal and regulatory frameworks. How can we accommodate the indigenous materials in the regulatory process? That is an important challenge for all the building codes. And the people and governance, where we talk about how we can engage the people to participate individually and as well as collectively. The national policy making, the planning and implementation, monitoring of housing projects, and the managing of the services, and wider political processes. This whole framework actually enables the owner-driven, a participatory owner-driven process. Even though it is a transitional, but what are the different ways how we can engage them, and how, if we can actually give this kind of support systems, so this can gradually lead to an important transition in their lives, because they can be self-reliable, they can make their own system, they can rely on that system, they can, only we need to provide a little support system in order to progress with it. I hope you got a better idea on transitional housing in Kenya. Thank you very much.